So hang on. Yeah.
Well, if you're in our UK audience, let me welcome you this evening to this latest in our series of webinars from the Centre for Intelligent Design here in the UK. If you happen to be following this live and you're in the Pacific Northwest, then it's good morning to you, but we're delighted wherever you are that you've joined us today. We host today's event under the banner of the Centre for Intelligent Design here. We're really pleased that once again you've joined us for this session. Actually, I'm just realizing this is our 17th such webinar over the past couple of years. And our objective remains the same, and it has been to present a sequence of topics which provide an understanding of aspects of design in nature. We've been particularly keen to share evidence that calls the kind of default paradigm about the origin and complexity of living systems and their many characteristics into question. And actually asking questions and considering evidence is not only the healthy pursuit of truth, it's the way that the scientific endeavour has operated over the last several hundred years. So welcome today. We have focused on a whole range of different things in the past, ranging from virology. We've looked at origin of life science, we've looked at paleontology, we've even looked at some philosophical topics. We've had guests such as Mike Behe and Jim Tour, Doug Axe, Mike Denton, Gunter Beckley, Steve Meyer, and so on. And today we're going to introduce a new speaker to our programme. We're really delighted to welcome Dr Cornelius Hunter. Cornelius' name might well be familiar to some of you who follow the design debates online, and he's certainly been active in this field for a few decades now. And he is going to explore the hidden history of Darwin's theory of evolution and the religion, in quotes, which mandates it. Dr. Hunter is a graduate originally from University of Illinois. He got his PhD in biophysics and computational biology, and he currently holds some teaching posts at Biola, and where he is right now in the William Jessup University in Northern California. He's authored a number of books. One, Darwin's God, Evolution and the Problem of Evil. And he's also authored a book called Science's Blind Spot. He's a fellow of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, and his interest in the theory of evolution involves not just the historical aspects of this, but the theological and scientific side of the theory as well. So while I welcome the audience, it's a great delight, Cornelius, to welcome you. So good evening from here, good morning to you in Seattle, and we're really looking forward to you sharing your talk entitled Why Evolutionists Believe in Evolution. So it's over to you. Now, after your talk, we'll have an opportunity to have some Q&A, and if anyone would like to place a question or a comment, then use the YouTube chat facility to do that, and my colleague Dave Williams will be moderating the Q&A after Cornelius has spoken to us. Okay, Cornelius, welcome, and over to you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, David, and thank you again. I'm very delighted to be here. So I want to start with a question: why do people believe in evolution? Because there is no feasible cause, no mechanism for evolution, and that's important in science. Evolutionists have always said that random mutations is the cause, the ultimate cause behind the evolution of the entire biosphere, all the millions and millions of species, random mutations. And by the way, that's straight out of Epicureanism from 2,000 years ago. Remember, the Epicureans said it was random motion, the randomly swerving atoms that occasionally reached critical mass. They combined in different configurations to form things that worked and stuck around. It's kind of a precursor to evolutionary thought, random mutations. Well, it didn't work very well for the Epicureans, and it doesn't work for evolution. Random mutations just aren't going to cut it. They're not sufficient to create the biosphere. And even evolutionists have recognized that more recently. So it's just anyone who understands the science of the search problem, you cannot create the kind of species, kind of complexities we find in this universe. Now, maybe there's a universe where that would work, but not this universe. Random mutations is just not going to cut it as a cause, as a mechanism for evolution. So why do people believe in evolution? This is the question I'm posing here. Now, some evolutionists will say, well, wait a minute, true, right. The mutations are random with respect to need. They're not going to do the job alone, of course. But you're forgetting about natural selection. And natural selection is the key here. That's the key to the evolutionary puzzle that Darwin came up with. And that's what does the job. Well, again, that doesn't cut it either. Natural selection is not a cause. Natural selection is a label, a description for a process, how a good mutation, a helpful mutation can survive. But it isn't actually a cause. The key here is that natural selection does not create or cause mutations to occur. Natural selection cannot coax, it cannot cajole, it cannot induce good mutations to occur. It doesn't say, gee, we got this problem here, we need this mutation here, let's have this mutation. Unfortunately, that's often how the literature kind of describes things, kind of slips off into this teleological language of natural selection is this kind of intelligent agent, kind of like this little creator doing things. And that's not how it works. It cannot work that way. Natural selection is limited to the mutations that are available. And so we're back to random mutations. Every single species of the millions and millions of species, from the leopard to the oak tree to the blue whale to humans, everything must have been created ultimately by random mutations. That's evolutionary theory. I'm not making this up. Of course, there's many other sorts of mechanisms after that evolutionists have to try and contrive to tell the story. But ultimately, even those must have been created by these random mutations. So we're back to this random mutation problem. You can throw in natural selection into the story. It doesn't help. So again, I'm back to this question, why do people believe in evolution? Now, other evolutionists will say, well, wait a minute, there's all this scientific evidence for evolution. It's just this plethora of scientific evidence for evolution. And that's just so compelling. Well, actually, no, that's not true. That's a myth. The science contradicts the theory of evolution. It consistently has contradicted ever since 1859, when Darwin published his book, Origin of Species. The science has been a problem. In fact, it was a problem for Darwin in his book, and it's continued to be that way. And since Darwin, there have been fierce debates. Not surprisingly, evolutionists have had fierce debates about how evolution actually is supposed to have worked. There's all these different ideas, all these different sub-hypotheses about how evolution must have or would have worked. Why? Because there's no one hypothesis that actually does work. And this is one of those cases where a plethora of ideas is not a good sign. What it means is you don't have a good explanation for how evolution is supposed to work by these random mutations and so forth. So you've got these debates going on. They're continuing till today, and nothing has changed. And now, in fact, you've got some evolutionists calling for a redo, a makeover. We need to drop the evolutionary theory, the traditional idea of how evolution is supposed to work, and we've got to just have something new. And they don't really have anything new right now. They've got a plethora of very complicated, more ideas, but they're different because what we've had isn't working. So I'm back to this question, why do people believe in evolution? And well, some people will say, well, hey, wait a minute, it's just a theory. It's just a scientific theory, it's not a big deal. People believe in it, it's not a big deal. Well, no, it isn't. That's not the case. That's a misunderstanding. Evolutionists have been very clear about this. You need to just listen to the evolutionists. Sometimes I think people don't listen to evolutionists enough. Read the literature, listen to evolutionists. They don't say that it is merely a theory. In fact, that's point's been made over and over again. It is much more than a theory. It is a fact. And that is the position that has been pounded home over and over ever since 1859. Evolutionists have been hard over, very confident, evolution is a fact beyond all reasonable doubt. So that brings me back to my question even more so now. Evolution is not merely a theory, it's a fact. Let's summarize this. You don't have a cause, you don't have a mechanism that works. You've got scientific problems. The science consistently contradicts it, this idea, and it's held to be an unequivocal fact. So this is getting stranger and stranger, right? Why do people actually believe in this? Now, other people will say, well, I'll tell you why. There are a bunch of atheists. Those rascals are propagating their atheism. No, again, not true. That's a myth. That's an unfortunate myth we call the warfare thesis. Science and religion are at loggerheads, and there's this battle, and that just isn't true. Evolutionists are, for the most part, religious people, or not, at least not atheists. Yes, there are atheists who are evolutionists for sure, but even the atheists don't use arguments from atheism. And I've never seen an argument. By the way, I'm a collector of arguments. I'm a collector of evidences for evolution. That got me interested in evolutionary theory. I look and search for the arguments and evidences for evolution. And you won't find any, I've never found one from atheism. So atheism really isn't playing a role here. And I don't like to hear people try and pin this all on the atheists. So I'm back to my question. We're in a very strange place here. Why do people believe in evolution? With that as a backdrop, I hope I've kind of piqued your interest to think about this a little bit. Now, if you read Charles Darwin's book, 1859, Origin of Species, long book here, Darwin gives a lot of arguments and evidences. In chapter 6 of Origin of Species, Darwin lays out the fact and explains to the reader, my theory is contingent on utilitarianism. Utilitarianism must be true. Otherwise, my theory is demolished. What was his words? Absolutely fatal. It would be absolutely fatal to my theory if utilitarianism is not true. Okay, that's interesting. We're getting a little bit of a hint here. What's this utilitarianism? Now, if you've heard of utilitarianism before, you're probably thinking of Jeremy Bentham and his theory of ethics, utilitarianism, and that is the most common use of that word. You might have run into it in a political science class as well, political theory. But utilitarianism was broadly influential, and it made its way into naturalism, into the sciences of the 18th century and 19th century. And in that case, the word utilitarianism, the term meant the idea that God created the species optimally. So for every function, for every environment that a species would occupy, its structures, its organs would all be designed optimally. Its skeleton and so forth would all be designed optimally for that situation. So perfect adaptation. That was the utilitarian approach. And the other approach, and there's a healthy debate in those years, the years that Darwin was developing his theory, there was a healthy debate both on the continent and in the United Kingdom of this utilitarianism versus another idea, which was, no, the species may be designed according to patterns. There may be God may have other concerns or other goals in mind, beauty, pleasure, all kinds of non-material possibilities that other naturalists were contemplating and argued for, such as Adam Sedgwick, a mentor at one time of Charles Darwin. And Sedgwick argued against utilitarianism. So there was a healthy debate, and Darwin, no question about it, laid it out right there in chapter 6. My theory, I am a utilitarian. My theory is absolutely staked to utilitarianism. That is, remember, what does it mean? The idea that if God had created the species, they would be perfectly adapted. for their environments. So utilitarianism is key, and nothing has changed after Darwin, by the way. This argument has continued. It predated Darwin and it continues to today. So utilitarianism is a very important idea to understand evolutionary theory. Now, how does this play into it exactly? Why was this so important to Darwin? What was so key? Why did he say this in chapter 6 of Origin of Species, that utilitarianism is so key, and he staked to utilitarianism? And if it wasn't true, it would be, quote, absolutely fatal to my theory. So what was it about utilitarianism? Well, Darwin, like many people at the time, it wasn't only Darwin, but Darwin expanded on this, said that the natural world was full of examples of disutility. And of course, he took that trip around the world in the HMS Beagle, early 1830s, 5-year trip around the world, and collected all kinds of examples. And his book is chocked full of examples that he considered to be disutility. And he talks about those over and over again. And so let's work through this logic here. If it's true that if God had created the species, they would be perfectly adapted, okay, that's step one. Step two, we have species that are not perfectly adapted. Step three, what's the logical result? Conclusion: God didn't create these species. God didn't design these species. God did not intend for these species. These were not a result of divine intention. So somehow, some way, those species must have arisen naturally. And hence, then you have the evolutionary narrative, and it can take any form. You can have random mutations and natural selection, gradualism, punctuated equilibrium, dozens and dozens. The list gets longer and longer of descriptions of how this could have happened. None of them are scientifically compelling or even, frankly, any good. But that's what evolutionary theory is trying to fulfill, is trying to figure out how could they. So you have the mandate to begin with, that evolution must be true. And then you have the workers, the naturalists, trying to fulfill that story, figure out how it could have happened. So that, in a nutshell, is a look at the big picture of evolution. But if I don't want you to go away from this talk thinking, oh, okay, so there's this non-scientific influence, non-scientific mandate for evolution called utilitarianism, and that's kind of the key. No, there's more to say. That gets more complicated. We're just starting to peek under the covers here. Utilitarianism is one of literally more than a dozen theological and metaphysical traditions over centuries of time that played a role here. So it's not utilitarianism at the root, at the core, at the foundation of evolutionary theory. Rather, it's a web, it's a foundation of theological, philosophical, metaphysical claims, traditions that were very powerful. Each one has its own history of the thinkers who developed it, the reasons behind it, its peak, and then it maybe tailed off. Some are strong today, some have tailed off, and so forth. By my count, there are 15 different theological, metaphysical traditions that, and you can see these in Darwin's notebooks, you can see them in Darwin's book, you can see them in the later evolutionary theory literature. But you certainly can see it before Darwin, in the centuries leading up to Darwin. And I mentioned the Epicureans a minute ago. Some of these go back to the Epicureans. This argument has probably been going on since people walked this earth. And you can see this in the Epicurean writings. But in the modern era, say, the era of modern science, additional concerns, additional theological arguments were developed. And as I said, I count about 15 of these. Now, what I'll do is I'll go over a few of these just to give you a flavor of these. So let me talk about a few of these. One is I call the greater God theology. Greater God theology. What's that? So the greater God theology is, imagine, I'll use the example that Thomas Burnet used in the 17th century, an English cleric. Imagine a clockmaker, and a clockmaker makes a clock and sets it down on the table. It works. Another clockmaker makes a clock, sets it down, but it doesn't work. He has to move the hands. He has to go in there and move the hands manually every hour, move that hand. Now, the question that Burnet asked, who's the greater God? Who's the greater clockmaker? Obviously, the first clockmaker who made the clock that worked. Very obvious here, right? Very obvious theology here. So he takes that analogy to the creator of the universe. Who's the greater creator of the universe? The one who makes a universe that just works on its own, or the creator of the universe who creates this universe and it's just kind of an empty box and he has to go in there and do things? Well, it's obvious, right? So it's a theological mandate for a God who creates by natural laws. He creates a world that works by itself. And this was picked up by the Lutherans on the continent, people like Gottfried Leibniz, but especially Christian Wolff, a generation after Leibniz. Christian Wolff vigorously defended and advocated for this sort of theological argument. Wolff insisted that he was an Orthodox Lutheran Christian the whole way. He did not see himself as a deist or some sort of a liberal Christian or anything like that. He saw himself as a right down the line Lutheran. So this gives you an idea of how these theological mandates can get into the thinking of otherwise Orthodox Christians. Greater God theology. By the time Christian Wolff was done with it, he had, in his view, established the fact. There was no question about it. God would have created a universe without using miracles, but rather natural laws. So you can see this greater God theology, how that would play into an evolutionary narrative. And you can see it in, for example, Darwin's notebooks. It was present in Darwin's grandfather's writings. Erasmus Darwin very much espoused right out of Christian Wolff and Thomas Burnet, this greater God thinking, how great this would be. And other Anglicans, after Darwin wrote his book, came out with, it's a great idea. It's a greater God. We always knew that God was so great. Now we can see it. So very much plays into this greater God theology. If you're a naturalist like Darwin, thinking about this theory of evolution, you've got this sort of foundation behind you, this sort of impetus behind you. You know the culture is primed for it. Let me talk about another one, infradignitatem, beneath the dignity. It's about the fact that this world, this cruddy, dirty world with all the minutiae, the worms and the crustacea and the reptiles, the little, the parasites, would God have created those? Isn't that a little bit beneath God? I mean, of course, we all agree God is sovereign, right? God is great. God is all powerful. Is he going to be creating worms? Seriously? Isn't that beneath his dignity? I'll give you a word picture for this that I like. I imagine you've checked into a hotel, you go into your room and it's a mess, and you call the front desk and say, hey, by the way, I just checked in and this room is a mess. And they say, oh, sorry, we'll send someone up to fix it right away. And in a minute, there's a knock on the door, and you open the door, and it's the owner of the hotel. So it's a rich and famous person. Pick a person that you know who's rich and famous. He owns this hotel, and he's standing there in a tuxedo, and he's got a mop in his hand and some cleaning fluid and sponges and things. And he's got the cart with all the stuff. And he says, I understand your room is a mess. And you say, yes, I'm waiting for someone to come here and clean it. He said, well, I'm going to do that right now. And he's in a tuxedo, and he gets down on his hands and knees, and he's got the cleaning fluid and the mop and the brushes and everything. He's working away. You would feel uncomfortable, and it just wouldn't seem right. It's what? Beneath his dignity, his or her dignity. So that's the idea here, that this world is just not befitting for a God to have created all this stuff. And this was advocated by, for example, Ralph Cudworth, a leading English scholar, one of the top scholars in England in the 17th century. After him, John Ray, a botanist, one of the leading scientists, and by the way, the father of English natural theology, the 18th century, early 19th century movement. At least for many, John Ray would be the father of natural theology. And so here you have, and these are leading Christians, leading Christian thinkers, advocating this infra dignitatem sort of idea that God would not have created this world personally, not all of the nitty-gritty parts of this world. And by the way, all of these 15 different traditions that I'm talking about, they aren't tangential. None of these are I'm not talking about, some obscure figures holding these. These are advocated by leading top thinkers, mostly Anglican and Lutherans, by the way. There are a few Roman Catholics here and there, but most of them in the modern science period that I'm kind of focusing on here. I'm not going back to antiquity right now, although you can find some back in antiquity. But in the modern science period, it's mostly Anglicans and Lutherans. Another example, miracles, just miracles in general. In the, again, 17th, 18th centuries, there were increasing questions about miracles. Could these really happen? Are there really all these miracles happening? I'm not so sure about this. There were vigorous debates. There was a great debate for about the 50 years, the first half of the 18th century in the United Kingdom, a huge debate about miracles. And what are we going to do about this? So miracles had always been a powerful argument, a powerful reason for your faith, for your Christian faith. Remember at the Last Supper, Philip had an interchange with Jesus, and Philip said, just show us the Father and we'll believe, something like that. And Jesus said a few things, and he ended up saying, also, believe for the sake of the works, the miracles. I mean, look at what I've done. Do you need more than this? So ever since then, there's been this, focus, or at least historically Orthodox Christian theology has recognized miracles as having a legitimate and important role. But here, this was being questioned. And by the time you get to Hume in the mid 18th century, people are ready for Hume's message. And in chapter 10 of his book in the mid-century there, of miracles, Hume argued strongly against miracles. Now that his arguments were fallacious, and it really fell apart, but they met with itching ears, and people liked it. So there were people at the time who argued against Hume and said, this doesn't make any sense, but they didn't carry the day. Hume was very influential. And of course, Darwin was well read on his Hume. And so by the time you get to Darwin in the 19th century, miracles were increasingly looked down upon. And if you can come up with a creation story that doesn't use miracles, there's a lot of people who are going to like that. So miracles, the problem of miracles. Another one, the problem of distiliology. This one is a kind of like utilitarianism. Remember, utilitarianism was the problem of disutility, things that don't look like they work right. And by the way, let me give you an example of the utilitarianism. I didn't give any examples. One example that Darwin used, there's many examples, was birds that have webbed feet, but yet don't normally go near the water very much. They're not very aquatic. Upland, the upland goose, for example, has webbed feet. And so Darwin used that as an example of disutility. He had many other examples. Distiliology is similar to that, except it deals with things that just don't look like they were designed. It's not, in fact, most of the examples that evolutionists have come up with actually work really well and have fascinating, incredible designs and functions to them. But they don't look right. They just look like, there's no way that somebody would have designed this, let alone the God of the universe. And so one example that has been popular in recent years here is our eye. At the photoreceptor cells in our eye are backwards. The photoreceptor cells are located in the retina at the back of our eye, and they have one end of them contains small organic molecules that are sensitive to light, the light receptors. And the light receptors are on the back end, not on the front end. And then there's one end where the signal comes out. Well, that's on the front end. So the incoming light comes into your eye and it goes through, finally reaches these photoreceptor cells, and the light has to work its way through the photoreceptor cell to get to the business end where it detects the light, and then the signal comes, the electrical signal is going to come back at you. It's all backwards. And there's actually a consequence of this. It's our blind spot. We do have a portion of our retina where the optic nerves, the neurons, come together and dive through the retina and go off to the brain. So there's a spot where we don't have sensitivity. We have a blind spot. So there's a real negative there that evolutionists have pointed to and have used this as an example of, there is just no way that a creator would do this, that a God would design this. And it has now come to light that there's actually very good reasons for this, and it's a fascinating design for several reasons. I won't go through all the details here, but the optics involved are fairly complicated, and it works really well. In fact, cephalopods they have a very similar eye, but they don't have that backwards. Their photoreceptor cells are oriented the right way, so to speak. And so they don't have a blind spot. So we know that this is possible. Why didn't God do it the right way with us? But they don't have the kind of sensitivity that we have, at least in that regard, because of these incredible optical tricks that are used to enhance our vision because of the orientation of the photoreceptor cells. So it usually turns out this way. You have things that don't look right. The Distiliology argument surfaces, and yet when you look under the detail, you look at the details and look under the hood, you find, this actually works really well, and it's very complicated. So that's Distiliology. Again, I've got like a list of 15 of these. And I'm not making these up, and they're not tangential. These are leading thinkers, for the most part, Christian thinkers in the last 500 years, who have come up with these different arguments for a strictly naturalistic origins narrative. So what's the point of all of this? Evolution, whether you are for it or against it, is not a simple idea. Evolution is not just science. You can dispel that right away. And it's not atheism. It's not atheism in disguise, as they say. Evolution is a complex theological movement that has recruited science. And this was one of the accomplishments of Darwin. He was, his book was loaded with theology, loaded with religion. It's a theological treatise. but he made it sound scientific. He made it look scientific. It has a scientific patina on it. He never uses the G word. He never talks about God, but it's got theology all through it. And so evolution is not just science. It's not atheism in disguise. It's a complex theological movement that has recruited science. It's deeply theological, and you cannot decouple evolution from these underlying motives. So you've got this web of theological claims, traditions, forming this foundation, and then you've got, scientific language piled on top of that. It goes back to antiquity, as I said. It's been further developed in the last 500 years, but it goes back to antiquity. People have probably been arguing about this since they walked this earth. And these are classic themes that have been debated over and over again. These are classic themes, and it's no different today. It's not as though, well, that was Darwin, that was back in the 1800s, and now we've got, strong science. No, there's no difference. There's no difference. The science is frankly laughable to think that the biosphere arose from mutations. It's just not. There's anyone familiar with the science would know this does not work. And I'm not a creationist. I'm not against evolution from a theological or philosophical perspective. I'm fine with evolution being true. It doesn't bother me in the least. It would be fascinating if it was, because it is contradicted by the science over and over and over again. So, and like I said, you don't have to take my word for it. Read the evolution literature, or listen to what the evolutionists are saying. Evolutionists have been very clear about this. The religion is all through the literature, and the problems with evolutionary theory are through the literature, are in the literature. So evolution is, and the whole origins debate is far more complicated and far more nuanced than you normally hear in the popular press, or even in the academic journals and in academia, which so often is a dumbed down version of what is actually going on and has gone on in the history of the origins debate and origins thinking. So, David, that's my introduction. Are there any questions for us at this point?
Thank you,
Thanks,
Cornelius. Well, people will post questions as we continue on the live chat. But can I start by asking this? Why does and I'm going to just call it evolution. Why does it have to be, in your argument, theological? Is it not possible that evolution is a scientific theory which has theological implications? Or it may even, as you've listed some of the people that you've talked about, it may even have theological motivations, but the theory itself is scientific. Do you accept that, or do you say no, the theory itself is theological?
I don't accept it, and I do say the theory itself is theological. But let me say a few words about it without just saying yes or no here, because it's a great point. So you made two points. One is, could it be scientific? And then it's got, yes, theological implications. And that, of course, is what evolutionists will want to say whenever you confront them with this. They say, oh, that's just the theological implications. And Darwin was bringing up all these religious things just because he was addressing the audience. But it all comes from science in the beginning. And that just isn't true. And you just have to look at the scientific arguments. Why did Darwin believe it? Why have later evolutionists believed it? Getting back to my theme question here, why do people believe in evolution? So it just doesn't fit the facts that it is scientific. But you made the second question, which is, well, maybe it is theologically motivated. Okay, let's go along that line. But it emerges from that as a legitimate scientific theory that, the science and religion can work together. And so you have religion kind of pointing the way, kind of suggesting the way, coming up with some interesting motivations, but then you have science, people, okay, let's look at the science. Darwin looked at the science. Later evolutionists looked at the science. They found the science to be compelling. So that's another way to interpret it. Again, it just doesn't work, and for several reasons. One is the arguments and evidences for evolution have not changed in quality. They're the same as they were for Darwin, the same as they were before Darwin. We still, in the year 2022, have evolutionists espousing these same religious arguments for evolution. Point number two, the science hasn't changed. It was terrible in Darwin's day. He struggled. It was a defensive action throughout the book. I mean, much of this book is backpedaling, trying to explain away the science. It's the religion that does the heavy lifting. Those are where he has his powerful arguments, where the hammer comes down. It's the same way today. If anything, the science is worse because we know more. So if it were the case that, the science emerges from the religion and fortuitously they work together, then you'd have good scientific evidence and you'd have good scientific reason for believing this. But we don't have that. We have more scientific problems, huge scientific problems. Now, let me make one more point on this, because I think this is kind of interesting. Let's continue on with this possibility, this idea that, hey, maybe the science and religion are working together. Religion had some motivations. Religion spurred it on, but then good science emerged from that, which I just explained is not the case, both historically as well as today's science. But one more point on that, if it were true, boy, that would be a coincidence, wouldn't it? What an incredible coincidence if religious thinking, totally, decoupled from the scientific details, came up with the answer. And then when the scientists looked at, oh, hey, it turns out it's true. The religious guy, my pastor said to look at this, and it was true. I mean, that would be quite a coincidence. And I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this. It's a little easier to believe that that the religion is playing the role here. But so a lot of problems with that idea, and that's what you'll always hear from the evolutionists. It just doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit the literature. It doesn't fit what they're saying. It doesn't fit the scientific evidence.
Cornelius, let me ask you, so I had never really quite squared up to this whole idea of the various theological and philosophical traditions of which you gave several examples. Now, let me just make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. So, was the thrust of these various attempts to explain what we find in nature, was the thrust of that to try and locate it in some kind of naturalistic understanding ultimately? Was it either an argument that says, well, God would never have done it this way, this is a botched design argument essentially, or an appeal to miracles and so on? I mean, just where do these all kind of fit in? Am I getting that right?
That you're getting to the deeper level of motivations. And what were these people thinking and why? And today, why are people thinking this today? And it is a mixed bag, but I do think there are, legitimate religious people trying to juxtapose God and creation. And how do I understand God? Just look at Christian theology to begin with. You've got the sovereignty you get this Trinity thing, where you've got the sovereignty of God, the majesty, the power, the awe, and then you've got this baby in a manger who could be killed at any moment and is vulnerable and grows up and learns about the world and scripture and so forth. So it's all, how do you understand all this? And that, now you throw in the question of origins. How do I understand God creating the world? And so the problem of evil, the problem of utilitarianism, distiliology. And so I think whether you want to say they're unorthodox Christians or heretical or well-meaning or whatever, they're people who are seeking answers and would like to know the answer, and they're convinced that they have it because there's just no way that they can believe. They're utterly convinced. And by the way, I mean, these people are very convinced. This is not, a lot of us, when we talk about deep Christian theology, we admit, I'm not so sure about this. This is very complicated. Not so with most of these traditions. They are utterly convinced that they're right. Christian Wolff, I mentioned him, Thomas Burnett, there's many others. Nicholas Malebranche on the Roman Catholic side, coming up with these ways to juxtapose God and the world, and inevitably they turn out to be distancing God from the world. That's usually the end result for one reason or another, whether it's the evil, the Distiliology, beneath his dignity, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and you could argue, well, maybe some of them are disingenuous. Maybe these are atheists in disguise, or they're bad, or they're whatever. And who knows what ultimate motives people have. But if you just take them at their word and what they're writing, like I said, Christian Wolff insisted he was an Orthodox Lutheran. So it's a mixed bag. Each one has its own story, and that's what I write about in my papers. There's 15 different stories here, and they have personalities involved, and philosophical and theological premises involved, and influences involved. They come from a variety of influences over the
Cornelius, can I just tease out the motivation? I was interested, intrigued almost, by the fact that you mentioned many of these thinkers were coming from a religious standpoint, Lutheran, Anglican, whatever.
Absolutely.
I could understand that more if they post-date Darwin, or they post-date the growth and the acceptance, if you like, the cultural acceptance of Darwin, because then you could say their motivation would be to try to square the circle, or the apparent conflict between science and religion, and therefore they accept the science as they see it in evolution, and therefore come up with the theology to match it. But that doesn't explain the thinking of the pre-Darwin theologians. So you mentioned the greater God theology, for example, the beneath his dignity. If they predate Darwin, and they predate a culture in which creation in some sort of form is rejected, so in their culture it's accepted, what was their motivation as religious people to try to effectively argue against a religious explanation? That puzzles me.
Right. And so I think it's a great question. And I think you are correct that post-Darwin, there are Christian and other theologians who are trying to square the circle, as you put it, and trying to reconcile. So that does fit certain people. But to explain the ones before Darwin, one of the things that people need to do is come to the realization that Darwin was not this intellectual revolutionary that changed everything and came up with this brand new theory. He was an important guy along the way, no question about it. But this was all already in motion. It was already moving. The tracks had been laid, and he was taking that and putting on the scientific patina. He came up with this very scientific sounding explanation, but this has all been laid. And so then you say, okay, why? Why were these Lutherans and Anglicans and a couple of Roman Catholics coming up with these, what sound to be, to us modern ears, maybe I should say maybe conservative Christians or Orthodox Christians? It sounds like a wrong answer. Well, religious people come in all flavors, and there's a very strong push, even within the Christian church, toward a deistic, let's distance God a little bit here. I don't like God getting too close to the world. He's too messy for him. Got to protect God, and so forth. And so don't underestimate the felt needs of religious people to control and cover up their God and protect their God from what they see as threats to his majesty and so forth. So it's just non-biblical. This is non-biblical thinking getting into even people who are of the word, right? Even Christians adopting non-biblical thinking. Obviously, all of these 15 traditions are non-biblical at some point. And so just don't underestimate the power of these traditions.
Would it follow from that something that might be known as theistic evolution ultimately would suffer the same criticism that it's non-biblical?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. The theistic evolution is not so. One of the things I try and teach my students in today's world, you get these labels. There's evolution, and then there's theistic evolution. It's really kind of a false dichotomy. There really is evolution is theistic. All of evolution is theistic. There are some who want to talk about the theology more. So we call those theistic evolutionists, but it's all theistic. And there are many Christians today and Muslims and Jews, etc., who believe in evolution. Why do they do that? Why do they believe in evolution? So that was getting back to my question. These are perennial issues that transcend 1859. We've been debating these issues forever, and there are people today, just like there were 2,000 years ago, who really want a naturalistic explanation, and it explains. Once you understand the role of religion, you understand theistic evolution a lot better. Because if you don't understand the role of evolution, if you do not understand the role of religion, then theistic evolution is kind of this weird, what's going on here? You have these people who have, they're professors, they have life science degrees, they're very smart people, and they're advocating for evolution. The science isn't very good. And you're making these religious arguments. What's going on here? Why are all these Christians advocating for evolution? Well, once you understand the role of religion, that transcends Darwin, it transcends 1859, it's been around forever. It's still around today.
Well, Cornelius, building on a question that's come in as well. The question comments that it seems the root of the problem is random mutation. That if mutation, and here it goes on to say this, if mutations are not random, but overseen or, quote, designed by God, does the problem still exist?
Yeah, so you can get into ideas of how God guided evolution. God used evolution as his creation tool. And then you have, it's at the quantum level or whatever, God is using these. And so the mutations are not random. Well, in that case, you have a pretty big problem with evolutionary theory. So evolutionary theory is not going to like that. But sure, you can. Now we're getting into the question of, well, how did it actually happen? What actually did happen? And God could have created the world in many different ways. It's hard, I certainly don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know how God created the world, all the details. What mixture of miracles and natural causes did he use? Maybe there were mutations involved, and maybe he guided them. So yeah, if God wants to use mutations, millions and millions and gazillions of mutations that he creates, he guides, he could have created the world that way. That is not going to be very satisfying to evolutionary theory, but that's a possibility. Who knows?
Okay, and just looking at the other side of the same coin, we've been examining the Christian beliefs, if you like, or wider theological beliefs. I think you made a statement that evolution is not atheistic, I don't know the exact words.
Right.
One question that's come in is this: how can one distinguish between evolutionary theory as a proposal not based on atheism, so evolution not being atheist or atheistic based. How can you separate that from the fact that the questioner says, at least since Huxley, evolution has become a mainspring of atheistic apologetics?
Yeah. So for sure, the success of evolutionary theory, its dominance over practically the whole world, which happened in the first century after 1859. It just took over the world. It didn't do it right away, but it eventually dominated the world. For sure, that fueled atheism. And Richard Dawkins has made a statement to that effect, and it makes evolution intellectually satisfying. So no question about it. Once you get to the point where you believe evolution is true, you're certain that evolution is true, no question about it, then hey, let's just go with atheism. I mean, yeah, you can go with theistic evolution, but let's just, go to the obvious here and drop the redundancies and just go with atheism. So there's no question about it that evolution has fueled atheism, and atheism has risen and has grown as a consequence of the wide popularity and dominance of evolution. But that doesn't mean, and so unfortunately, people look at that and think, oh, it's atheistic. There's so many atheists. But again, none of the arguments used by these atheists are from atheism. In fact, if you look at the arguments from Richard Dawkins, he uses the same theistic arguments. The atheists very commonly use the same metaphysical, theistic, theological arguments that had been used by the Christians. They're simply borrowing. So their position has a massive internal contradiction. They are relying on metaphysical assumptions and religious theological assumptions that they could never justify under atheism. In fact, they refute atheism. They cause these major internal contradictions. So atheism has always been a problematic position to hold, to put it kindly. It falls apart under its own weight. So that's atheism. The real complexity of evolutionary theory is this deep theology and the web of theological both traditions and beliefs that motivate and mandate evolutionary theory, and that evolutionary theory entails and requires.
Okay. Question that's come in is this. John Ray wrote, quote, "The wisdom of God manifested in the works of the creation," close quote, and promoted divine design. And the question is, did Ray really use arguments that say the world is not the kind of world God created?
Hard to believe, isn't it? John Ray wrote that book, that tome. That was his tome, and many editions of that work in the early 18th century, considered by many to be the father of natural theology. But following Ralph Cudworth, John Ray believed that there was something in between God and the world. So God did not create the world directly, but there was a vice principle, an agent, and they had a word for it. Cudworth had a term for it: plastic nature. And so plastic nature was not a God. It was more like an agent, some sort of a intermediate between God and the world. So God kind of told this agent, okay, go create, these species and do this. And then it went off and did things. But since it wasn't God, it didn't do it perfectly. And it was okay for it to muddle up in the world because it wasn't God. Yes, John Ray believed that. John Ray advocated a plastic nature. Both Cudworth and Ray were also influenced by the problem of evil. Would God create this evil? And say, no, he wouldn't. So infra dignitatem, problem of evil, were both active in Cudworth's and Ray's thinking, and they both concluded for a plastic nature and that God would not have directly created this world. And yet you have John Ray making the argument that all the beauty and the complexities of this world prove God. And he was a leader of natural theology. So don't generalize or stereotype Christians or even natural theologians or today creationists or intelligent design folks. They don't necessarily hold to an historically orthodox view that you might think.
So it would almost seem that evolution to them was a theological escape from other theological problems concerning the apparent nature of God.
You could say a theological escape. You could say theological solution. Or you could just say this was their theology. And as I said, it goes back. You can see it in the Epicurean. When you read the Epicurean arguments, for example, as documented by Cicero, it almost reads like something out of today's literature. It's uncanny, and you realize this has been around a long time. This debate, this argument, these views, and it's not as though modern science discovered evolution and Darwin discovered evolution. Darwin, at the end of Darwin's book, he had a summary. He kind of like arguing in a court of law. At the very end, you make your summary case to the jury. Darwin made his summary argument and said, okay, you've read 400 pages here. Here, I'm distilling this thing down. And I got these 6 points. And these are my points. And it's all religious. There was a couple of scientific arguments that were weak, that were ridiculously weak. All of his strong points were religious. But you have to, of course, they were not obviously religious. You have to understand the context and read what are the premises that he's basing his arguments on and so forth. So it's not always obvious. You have to, you have to be a student to understand this. But my point here is that when the hammer comes down, when the strong arguments are made, they're religious. And when if you restrict yourself just to the science, it's ridiculously weak. And whenever you get into discussions and arguments or debates with evolutionists, there's always going to be religion in one way or another, and it's hard to decipher sometimes.
Well, here's the question I want to finish on then, Cornelius. If we, as intelligent design proponents, would say, if we got into this mess or this wrong thinking as a result of theology, how do we get out of the mess? Is the escape theological, or is the escape scientific? You've talked about the lack of scientific evidence for the theory. So how does one defeat the prevailing view, if you like? Do you attack it from a scientific basis, evidential basis, or is it you attack it from the theology or theological, which is where it started?
That's a great question. I appreciate that because I have thought a lot about that. I do think it's both. I think you have to have both. People need to be trained. I don't like specialization. I don't like people not knowing anything. The specialist knows this. My pastor tells me this. I don't like that. I would like for everyone to be both a scientist and a theologian and everything else, a philosopher, historian, history of the church. We need to know these things. But I do think it starts with the science. I think you start with the science and you demonstrate. It's so easy to demonstrate clearly the absurdity. I'll use that word, and I use it advisedly. That word is overused, but I think there's times where it's appropriate, and this is one of them. Evolution is an absurd theory. It's clearly absurd. So I think you need to demonstrate the absurdity of the theory, but you need to be aware of this theological foundation and history because it's going to come at you, and it's going to come at you in disguise. It's going to be difficult to parse out. So you need to be aware of that, but I think you need to have a scientific approach to begin with. But you'll be square and you'll be solid when you understand the history and philosophy and theology that's behind this whole arena that's at the heart of evolutionary theory.
Okay. Well, many thanks, Cornelius. I found that a fascinating talk and a great deal of thought-provoking arguments there. So thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm going to hand back now to David Galloway, who I'm sure will have more thanks to you.
Yeah, good, David. Thank you. And Cornelius, let me add my thanks. You know, that was one of these webinars which was of a completely different flavour, a different approach to the kind of material that we've often focused on in this series. So I'm really delighted that we were able to open up that whole area, and hopefully it will point people towards your written output and some of the material that you've published through the Discovery Institute as well. So thank you very much for that. And thanks also to the audience. There were several instances of really good questions and one or two comments still coming in, so that's great. So thank you very much everyone for your engagement. Let me just remind folks that we do have a presence on the internet at C4ID, so make sure you search us out there. You'll get all the links to previous webinars and other useful material that's there. And as far as the YouTube channel is concerned, if you're still on YouTube, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any of the new content. We don't plan another webinar for November, but we do have one fixed for early next year. We'll send out more details in due course, but we're looking forward to another new speaker as far as C4ID in the UK is concerned, and that's Dr Kirk Durston, who will be with us on the 16th of January, also a biophysicist and a bit of a philosopher too. So we don't have a title yet from Kirk, but we'll make sure that's circulated just as soon as it's available. So with that, we'll sign off, but thank you very much to everyone, in particular to David, my colleague, and to Cornelius. A special thanks to you for joining us this afternoon, as it will be for you now, I guess, in the United States. And we'll be in touch with the next one in due course.
Thank you.